It was supposed to be a romantic weekend getaway for my husband and me. We had checked into a charming, old hotel tucked away in the countryside. The atmosphere was quaint, and the creaky wooden floors added to its rustic charm. Little did we know that our peaceful escape would turn into a nightmarish encounter with a man named Colin. The first night was uneventful. We enjoyed a candlelit dinner in the hotel's cozy dining room and retired to our room. The antique furnishings and dimly lit lamps created a serene atmosphere that helped us relax. But as the clock neared midnight, strange sounds began echoing through the hallways. Thumping footsteps, like heavy boots on the wooden floors, jolted us awake. At first, we thought it was just another guest returning late to their room. However, the footsteps grew louder and more erratic, echoing through the narrow hall. I nudged my husband, who was already tense and alert. "What is that?" I whispered, my heart pounding. He shook his head, equally mystified. The footsteps seemed to circle our room, sometimes growing faint before returning with even more intensity. It was as if the intruder was intentionally trying to unnerve us. My husband cautiously approached the door, peeking through the peephole. What he saw chilled him to the bone. A tall man with disheveled hair and wild, darting eyes was pacing the hallway. It was Colin. He had a crazed look in his eyes, like a man on the brink of madness. Colin's disoriented behavior sent shivers down our spines, and it was clear that he was not in his right mind. My husband quickly locked the door, but that didn't quell our fear. Colin's menacing presence was overwhelming, and we had no idea why he was behaving this way. Had he become unhinged, or was he harboring some malevolent intent? We debated calling the hotel staff or the police, but the fear of provoking Colin and escalating the situation made us hesitant. Our room had no phone, and venturing into the hallway to find help seemed like an unimaginable risk. We huddled in the dimly lit room, our ears strained for any clues about Colin's movements. The footsteps continued for hours, a maddening dance of chaos just beyond our door. As the night dragged on, exhaustion and fear wore us down. We dozed off in fits and starts, only to be jolted awake by the strange sounds in the hallway. The hours passed like an eternity. When the dawn finally broke, the noises ceased. The hotel returned to its serene facade, as if the unsettling night had been nothing but a twisted dream. With the rising sun, we decided to finally seek out help. We reported the harrowing encounter to the hotel staff, who were just as perplexed as we were. They assured us that they had no guest by the name of Colin, and there was no record of such a guest ever staying at the hotel. We left the quaint inn with our nerves frayed and questions unanswered. To this day, we wonder who Colin was and what had driven him to haunt our night in such a terrifying manner. I worked the night shift as a hotel cleaner, and for the most part, it was a quiet and uneventful job. But one night, as I was walking down the dimly lit corridor, pushing my cleaning cart, I encountered a guest who would send chills down my spine. The hallway was eerily quiet, except for the soft hum of the overhead lights. The guests were supposed to be asleep in their rooms, and the only sounds were the muffled voices coming from the television shows they left on. My shift was peaceful, and I took comfort in the solitude. As I approached one of the guest rooms, the door swung open suddenly. I was startled and stepped back, nearly dropping my cleaning supplies. A man emerged from the room, and his presence was immediately unsettling. His eyes were bloodshot and filled with an intense, almost predatory, focus. I muttered an apology. "I'm sorry. I didn't expect anyone to be coming out." But he didn't respond, just stared at me with those intense eyes. His behavior was off, to say the least, and my instincts told me that something was wrong. Nervously, I continued down the hallway, pretending like nothing had happened. But I could feel his gaze following me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My heart raced as I tried to focus on my cleaning duties and the task of making my way through the remaining rooms. I reached the end of the hallway, and when I glanced back, I saw that the man had turned and was now walking in the opposite direction. I heaved a sigh of relief, thinking that the strange encounter was over. I had one more room to clean on this floor, and I was eager to complete my work and leave the unsettling hallway behind. As I entered the last room, I could hear the distant sound of footsteps approaching. I quickly began tidying up the space, determined to finish my job and get out of there. But as the footsteps drew nearer, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was coming back, and I dreaded the thought of another encounter with him. Sure enough, I heard the room's door creak open, and my heart sank. It was him. He had followed me and was now standing in the doorway, his presence looming ominously. "I've been watching you," he said in a chillingly calm voice. I froze, fear gripping me. I didn't know how to respond. My mind raced, trying to come up with a way to defuse the situation. "What do you mean?" I stammered, my voice trembling. "You're very pretty," he continued, ignoring my question. "I've been waiting for you." His words sent shivers down my spine, and my body tensed with fear. I had no way of knowing what this man was capable of, and I knew I needed to get out of the room and away from him. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I put on a brave face. "I need to finish my work. Please, let me do my job." His gaze remained fixated on me, but he finally stepped aside, allowing me to pass. I hastily collected my cleaning supplies and left the room, not daring to look back. I rushed through the rest of my cleaning tasks, praying that I wouldn't encounter the man again. When my shift finally ended, I reported the chilling encounter to my supervisor and the hotel security. They reviewed the surveillance footage and discovered that the man had been lurking in the hallway, watching me throughout the night. The police were called, and the man was removed from the hotel. I breathed a sigh of relief knowing that he was no longer a threat. Still, the encounter haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability that had enveloped me that night. My experience as a hotel cleaner on the night shift had always been monotonous and uneventful, but that one terrifying encounter changed everything. I used to work as a hotel receptionist, and I was accustomed to the late-night check-ins, the exhausted travelers, and the endless stream of guests. But one night, my ordinary routine took a terrifying turn that I would never forget. It was a slow evening, and I was handling the night shift alone. The clock had just struck midnight when a young couple entered the lobby. They appeared to be in their late 20s, and by all appearances, they seemed like any other guests. I greeted them with a polite smile and checked them into their room, offering the usual amenities and services. The couple was polite and seemed like typical travelers looking for a quiet place to rest. I handed them the key card, wished them a pleasant stay, and watched them head to their room. As the night continued, I focused on my work, making sure everything was running smoothly. Hours passed, and the hotel remained peaceful and undisturbed. But just after 2 a.m., as I was organizing paperwork behind the front desk, I heard the entrance chime ring. I looked up and saw the young man from the couple standing in the lobby. He had a strange, almost vacant expression on his face. I approached him, inquiring if there was anything he needed. His response was unsettling. He seemed disoriented and mumbled incoherently about being unable to find his room. I offered to help and asked for his room number. He stared at me for a moment, and his response sent shivers down my spine. "I'm not sure," he said, his voice trembling. I decided to keep my composure and remain professional. I offered to look up their room number in the system. As I did, I couldn't help but notice how anxious and nervous he appeared. Eventually, I found their room number and directed him back to it. He hesitated for a moment, as if he wasn't entirely sure he should return to his room. It was an eerie moment of hesitation, but he eventually nodded and headed down the corridor. I watched him until he disappeared from sight and then tried to shake off the sense of unease that had settled over me. I couldn't help but wonder what had caused such strange behavior in the guest. I went back to my work but kept an eye on the lobby's security cameras, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man returning to his room. But he never did. The minutes turned into hours, and with the first light of dawn, I knew something was wrong. I decided to check on the room myself, unable to shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my stomach. When I arrived at the room, I hesitated for a moment. My training had prepared me for many scenarios, but I had never encountered anything like this before. I took a deep breath, and with trembling hands, I used my master key to unlock the door. The room was empty, the bed neatly made, and there was no sign of the young man. But the window was wide open, and it sent a shock of terror through me. I knew I had to report this to the authorities. The police were called, and an investigation began. The room held no clues to the man's whereabouts, and it became a mystery that both bewildered and horrified me. Weeks later, the investigation took a chilling turn. It was discovered that the young couple had checked in under a false identity. Their credit card was stolen, and the man's identification had been forged. The realization sent shivers down my spine. What had this man been running from, and who was he really? The questions haunted me, and the encounter in the dead of night left me with a chilling sense of unease. I could never shake the feeling that I had crossed paths with something dangerous that night, something that still lurked in the shadows, and that realization left me with a permanent sense of dread. I'd bought an old hotel that had been closed for 2 decades. My vision was to convert it into luxury apartments, a project that I believed held great potential. Excitement and anticipation coursed through me as I headed to the property, ready for the first survey with the team of professionals. We arrived at the hotel one evening, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The place was a relic of the past, the grandeur of its architecture shrouded in neglect. As we entered, our flashlights pierced the darkness, revealing the forgotten beauty of the place. The surveyors, a group of seasoned professionals, began their work. We explored the ground floor, making notes of the areas that needed the most attention for the renovations. The creaking of floorboards and the distant scuttling of unseen creatures lent an eerie ambience to the whole endeavor, but I pushed aside my unease. However, as we made our way to the upper floors, our journey took an unsettling turn. On the second floor, we discovered makeshift beds, tattered blankets, and discarded food wrappers. My initial thought was that it was squatters, but as we ventured further, our unease grew. On the 4th floor, we found evidence that this wasn't just a temporary hideout for squatters, but something more sinister. The walls were adorned with strange, cryptic symbols and graffiti. My heart pounded, and I couldn't dismiss the sense of foreboding that was quickly enveloping me. Then, we heard a faint rustling in the darkened hallway. The surveyors and I tensed, our flashlights dancing wildly as we scanned the shadows. Out of the darkness, a disheveled figure emerged. The man, clad in ragged clothes, was gaunt and unshaven, his eyes sunken and vacant. But it was the gun he clutched in trembling hands that sent our fear into overdrive. The squatters were not your typical homeless individuals looking for shelter. They were something else, something far more dangerous. We were intruders in their domain, and they seemed prepared to protect it at any cost. The leader of the surveyors, a no-nonsense professional, spoke to the armed man in a calm and reassuring tone. He explained our purpose, hoping to defuse the situation. But the man's wild eyes showed no sign of comprehension. My heart raced as I watched the confrontation unfold. The man's finger twitched on the trigger, and the situation teetered on a precipice. My mind raced, contemplating escape routes and praying that this wouldn't end in violence. Suddenly, a door on our left swung open, revealing another squatter, this one wielding a rusty knife. The tension escalated as more figures emerged from the shadows, each carrying makeshift weapons. Our presence had disrupted the fragile balance they'd established in this long-abandoned place. In that dire moment, the surveyors managed to convince the armed man to lower his weapon. It was a small victory, but one that allowed us to escape the hotel. We quickly descended the creaky staircase, my fear urging me to run, but the need for caution keeping me moving at a controlled pace. Once we were back in the safety of the evening air, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. We called the authorities, reporting the squatters and leaving the resolution of the situation in their capable hands. As I stood in the darkened street, looking back at the looming silhouette of the hotel, I realized that my dream of turning it into luxury apartments had encountered an unforeseen and unsettling reality. The night was cold, and we were exhausted. My wife and I had been driving for hours after attending a wedding in a distant town. The winding, deserted road stretched out before us, and fatigue was beginning to take its toll. The GPS showed no signs of civilization for miles, and the promise of sleep was a siren's call. Just as desperation started to seep in, a flickering neon sign pierced the darkness, "Motel vacancy." It seemed like a mirage, but there it was, the one thing we needed. We pulled into the motel's dimly lit parking lot, greeted by a few flickering bulbs and the low hum of the neon sign. The receptionist was a stern woman with an air of indifference. She didn't ask for IDs or any questions, just handed us an old, metal key with a tag that read Room 6. We didn't care about the lack of charm, all we wanted was a comfortable bed. The room, once we entered, was a time capsule from the 70s, complete with shag carpet and floral wallpaper. It was dingy but not unbearable, and we didn't mind. It was a roof over our heads, and that's all that mattered. Hours passed, and we drifted into a deep sleep, the events of the wedding day fading away. The room was silent, the only sound the occasional rumble of a passing truck on the distant highway. Then, a sudden, forceful knock shattered the stillness. My wife and I jolted awake, disoriented, unsure if we had heard correctly. But the second knock was even louder, more insistent, and we knew it was real. I stumbled to my feet and made my way to the door, my wife pulling the bedsheet around herself in anxious anticipation. I asked who it was, but there was no reply. Just another relentless knock. With a sense of unease, I cracked the door open, and my heart nearly stopped in my chest. Before me stood a man, tall and disheveled, his face twisted into a malevolent smile. He was a stranger, and his presence oozed danger. I felt a rush of panic and confusion. His voice was cold and detached, and he spoke with a bizarre intensity that made my skin crawl. He claimed to be the owner of the motel, but that couldn't have been true. The woman at the front desk was the one who had checked us in, not this sinister figure. My wife and I exchanged nervous glances, our instincts screaming at us to get out of there. The man's demeanor grew increasingly erratic as he continued to speak, his words making little sense. He seemed to revel in our discomfort, shifting his weight from foot to foot, the grin on his face growing ever more unsettling. As my wife and I exchanged whispers, we realized we needed to escape this eerie confrontation. It was an old motel, and the layout was straightforward. We decided to make a run for it, heading straight for the car. As we exited the room and sprinted toward the car, the man's eerie laughter echoed through the parking lot. Fear propelled us forward. We fumbled with the car keys, and I could sense his presence closing in. The engine roared to life, and we sped away from that dreadful place, leaving the sinister man and the grim motel far behind. We drove through the night, adrenaline coursing through our veins, putting as much distance between us and that chilling encounter as possible. We never reported the incident, but we couldn't erase the memory of that man's wicked grin or the way he spoke. It left us with a lingering sense of dread that still haunts our late-night drives. It was an ordinary evening, and I was at home, winding down after a long day of work. As a boiler repairman, my job was pretty routine. So, when I received a call from a small hotel about a boiler malfunction, I thought it would be just another job. They urgently needed someone to fix it, and I agreed to help, hoping to get it sorted quickly and head home to my family. When I arrived at the hotel, it was far from the glamorous image you might associate with such places. It was a small, run-down establishment that had seen better days. The manager, an elderly man, greeted me and explained that the boiler was located in the basement. He seemed anxious, and his hands trembled as he handed me the rusty iron key to the basement door. Carrying my toolbox, I descended the creaky stairs into the dimly lit basement. The air was heavy with a musty smell, and I could hear the soft hum of the malfunctioning boiler in the distance. As I approached it, I noticed a dark, splotchy trail leading away from the machine. Something had leaked or spilled around it. My initial thought was that it was a plumbing issue, but as I got closer, I realized this was far from normal. The trail didn't seem to be water, it was much thicker. I knelt down to get a closer look and discovered it was a trail of blood, fresh and still slightly warm. My heart began to race as my eyes followed the trail further into the darkness. The trail of blood led me to a gruesome sight. There, in the dim light, lay a lifeless body. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, nearly falling over. My mind raced as I tried to process what I had stumbled upon. The body, which appeared to be that of a young woman, lay in a pool of crimson, her lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling. In shock, I fumbled for my phone to call the police. As I waited for them to arrive, I couldn't help but glance around the basement. My heart pounded, and my mind raced, wondering if the killer was still lurking in the shadows. Fear and dread wrapped themselves around me like a vice, and every creak, every distant sound, sent shivers down my spine. The police arrived soon after, and I recounted what had transpired. They began their investigation, and I was questioned extensively. I told them I had no knowledge of how the woman ended up there. The authorities seemed to believe me, but their suspicions still hung in the air. The days that followed were filled with anxiety and dread. The hotel was shut down, and the investigation into the woman's death continued. Rumors about the murder in the basement swirled throughout the town. It was a chilling experience, knowing that I had unwittingly stumbled upon a crime scene while simply trying to do my job. In the end, the police concluded that I had no involvement in the woman's death, and her murder remained unsolved. But that encounter in the hotel's basement haunted my nights, and I could never shake the eerie feeling that I had been in the presence of something truly horrifying. I'm just a decorator, you know, or at least that's what I used to be. Painting walls, fixing cracks, and giving places a fresh look was my job. I didn't sign up for anything out of the ordinary, but sometimes life takes strange turns. It all started with a small motel, an old place with a dated aesthetic in desperate need of a makeover. I led a team of 3 skilled guys, each of them experienced in the art of transformation. We were accustomed to finding odd things behind walls, old newspapers, occasional lost items, but nothing could have prepared us for what we'd discover in room 12. As we stripped away the outdated wallpaper and prepared the walls for a fresh coat of paint, we heard a peculiar sound, like something metallic scraping against the wall. We looked at each other, puzzled, and decided to investigate. Behind the faded floral wallpaper, we found a peculiar hatch. It was old and rusty, like it hadn't been touched in decades. The previous owners of the motel had seemingly bricked it up, leaving it hidden from sight. We thought it was curious, but nothing to be alarmed about. We pried the hatch open with crowbars, and a musty smell emanated from the small, hidden compartment. My heart pounded in my chest as I peered inside. It was a small, dim space with ancient newspapers lining the floor. I could make out a glimpse of something shiny buried beneath the yellowed pages. My curiosity got the better of me, and I reached down, carefully pulling out what turned out to be an old wooden box. It was beautifully crafted, but time had not been kind to it. Its lid had a delicate engraving of a tree, leaves, and a name. The name sent shivers down my spine. It was marked as Maple. When we opened the box, a chilling discovery lay inside. Letters, photographs, and personal trinkets were meticulously organized within. There was a journal with entries spanning years, describing a deeply troubled woman's life. The name on those letters matched the one on the box, Maple. In her writing, Maple detailed her growing despair and dark thoughts, her sense of being watched, and her fear that she was losing her mind. It painted a vivid picture of a woman teetering on the brink of madness, and her words were laced with a profound sense of dread. The photographs were just as unsettling. They depicted a woman who had aged prematurely, her eyes haunted, her smile forced. And in the background of every photograph was the silhouette of a man, a sinister figure lurking in the shadows, always just out of sight. We continued digging through the box, uncovering more artifacts that told a disturbing story. It was a tale of an abusive relationship, mental anguish, and a desperate attempt to escape the clutches of the tormentor. The hidden compartment had served as Mabel's secret refuge, a place where she could document her descent into darkness. As we pieced together this horrifying puzzle, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had uncovered something more than just the past of a troubled woman. It was as though the very room carried an aura of suffering, as if the walls themselves held Mabel's cries and the room had trapped her torment. After we meticulously cataloged the contents of the box, I decided we needed to inform the authorities. Mabel's story had to be shared. The motel had harbored these dark secrets for far too long, and they couldn't stay hidden any longer. Our discovery haunted me for weeks after, the feeling of a dark presence still clinging to my mind. I realized that sometimes the horrors of the past can lurk behind walls, waiting for a curious painter to unearth them. It was a dark and stormy night when I found myself entangled in a web of deceit. I had been living a double life, cheating on my wife with a coworker. Our secret meetings were becoming a regular occurrence, and this time I had booked a hotel room for a night of passion. Guilt nodded me, but desire pushed it aside as I climbed the stairs to the hotel room. The room was dimly lit, and the tension was palpable as we started to undress. The sense of secrecy and thrill hung heavily in the air. The two of us were lost in the heat of the moment, and all seemed forgotten as we indulged in our affair. But then, a small sound caught our attention, a soft creaking noise, like the hinges of a door. The room had no windows, and the only door was the entrance. We froze, our eyes locked in a state of sheer panic. The creaking grew louder, and a shadowy figure emerged from the dimly lit corner of the room. My heart pounded in my chest as the man stepped forward, revealing himself to be hiding in the wardrobe. He was disheveled, with wild, darting eyes. It was evident that he was in a state of distress, and his presence was nothing short of terrifying. The woman I was with let out a scream, and I, too, felt the fear course through my veins. We hastily grabbed our clothes, our previous passion replaced by sheer panic. I fumbled for my phone, ready to dial 911 if need be. The man in the wardrobe mumbled incomprehensibly, a strange and unsettling smile stretching across his face. He had clearly been watching us for some time, and the realization sent shivers down my spine. My guilt had pushed me into a situation more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. The woman I was with, in a fit of hysteria, bolted for the door and flung it open. She ran down the dimly lit hallway, her screams echoing through the hotel. I, too, dressed hastily, keeping an eye on the man in the wardrobe who remained disturbingly calm. By the time I reached the hallway, the hotel staff had already called the police, alerted by the commotion. Officers arrived promptly and arrested the man in the wardrobe. He was later diagnosed with severe mental issues, explaining his irrational behavior that night. The incident left me shaken and changed my life forever. My secret double life unraveled, resulting in the breakdown of my marriage. The woman from work distanced herself, no longer willing to be part of the chaos that had taken over my world. My transgressions had led me down a dark path, one that led to a chilling encounter I would never forget. In the aftermath, the incident became a harrowing reminder of the consequences of betrayal and deceit, a dark chapter of my life that I could never erase. I was left to grapple with the guilt of my actions and the terror of that night, forever haunted by the chilling encounter in that dimly lit hotel room. It was a quiet, desolate night in the small motel I owned on the outskirts of town. The low hum of a flickering neon sign was the only source of light in the vicinity, casting eerie shadows that danced across the asphalt. The motel, with its faded exterior, had seen better days, but it was a place for weary travelers to rest their heads on a lonely stretch of highway. I was going about my usual late-night duties, making sure the place was in order and everything was set for any guests who might arrive. The motel had a reputation for being somewhat shabby, attracting a mix of travelers who preferred anonymity. That night, two men fitting the description walked through the door. Shifty characters, to say the least. One was tall and thin, with long, greasy hair that seemed to have not seen shampoo in weeks. The other was shorter and stockier, with a scruffy beard and a look that could make anyone uneasy. They approached the front desk, their eyes shifting around the dimly lit lobby. They requested a room, and I, with a growing sense of unease, signed them in and handed over the keys. As they walked to their room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Their furtive glances and hushed tones sent shivers down my spine, but I tried to push aside my apprehensions. Perhaps they were just tired travelers, nothing more. Several hours passed in eerie silence, the motel's vacancy making it feel like a ghost town. I was in my small office, catching up on some paperwork when I heard a series of muffled thuds and hushed whispers. My curiosity piqued, I decided to investigate. I stepped outside the office and found myself heading towards the room the two men had checked into. As I reached the door, the sounds from inside became clearer. It was not just whispers, but harsh, angry voices. My hand trembled as I raised it to knock on the door, but the words exchanged inside stopped me in my tracks. "You need to finish the job," one voice demanded. "I can't, it's too risky," the other replied. "What if someone hears or sees?" My heart raced, and a cold sweat covered my forehead. The implication was chilling, and the knots in my stomach tightened. It was becoming increasingly clear that I had stumbled upon something sinister. The men continued their hushed conversation. As I strained to listen, I caught words like money, disposal, and body. Panic set in. I knew I had to act, but I also knew I had to do so discreetly. I retreated to my office and called the police, providing them with as much information as I could. Fear gripped me as I relayed the situation, aware that my involvement might place me in danger. I was instructed to stay in my office and avoid any further contact with the men until the authorities arrived. Minutes felt like hours as I awaited the police. My mind raced, imagining the horrifying scenarios that could be unfolding in the room next door. The guilt of not acting sooner weighed heavily on me. Finally, the piercing sirens of a police car broke the stillness of the night. Multiple units arrived, and I guided them to the room of the two men. With guns drawn, they entered the room, and chaos ensued. Shouts and scuffling sounds filled the air. After what felt like an eternity, the police emerged from the room, escorting the two men in handcuffs. It turned out that they had been involved in illegal activities, which included the handling of illicit substances and disputes that had turned violent. The situation had been perilous, but the authorities had prevented the potential for greater harm. As they were led away, the men shot me menacing glares, promising revenge. The motel had become a hub of police activity, and the night seemed never-ending. When the dust finally settled, and the motel once again grew quiet, I couldn't help but think about how close I had come to a chilling and life-threatening encounter. The line between ordinary motel owner and unwitting accomplice had blurred in the darkness of that fateful night. As a hotel inspector, my job required me to visit numerous establishments to ensure they met certain standards and maintained quality for their guests. It was an unassuming night when I arrived at the next hotel on my list, and the name Hillside Inn sounded rather picturesque. The air was heavy with a drizzling rain, casting a gloomy aura over the aging building that stood on the outskirts of town. The Hillside Inn had an unsettling history, known locally for a series of strange occurrences and the abrupt departure of a previous inspector who refused to return. Most unsettling of all was the guest room numbered 314. Some guests had reported eerie encounters within, and the room had become infamous in the hotel's history. My instructions were clear. I had to inspect every nook and cranny, including room 314. What could possibly be wrong with a hotel room, I thought. I would soon discover that some mysteries are best left unsolved. The hotel lobby was dimly lit, adorned with dusty, antique furniture, and the hushed whispers of guests echoed around. The receptionist handed me the key to room 314 with a peculiar smirk that sent shivers down my spine. The rain outside was now pouring heavily, casting eerie shadows in the narrow hallway as I approached the infamous door. Unlocking the door revealed a room that seemed ordinary at first glance. The bed was neatly made, the curtains were drawn, and the room was chillingly silent. It was as if the very air had a weight of its own. With a clipboard in hand, I began my inspection. Everything appeared routine until I reached the bathroom. Upon entering, I was greeted by a disconcerting sight. The bathroom mirror, usually reflecting the sink, was obscured by something unusual. In the fogged glass, the words "Find me" had been etched. A shiver ran down my spine. It had been too quiet, and the air in the room felt dense and suffocating. Tentatively, I examined the rest of the bathroom, but nothing seemed out of place. I couldn't fathom who or what had left that message. As I moved back into the main room, the unease continued to grow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was now alone. A chill crawled up my spine, and I turned to see an indistinct figure standing in the corner, partially obscured by the dimness of the room. Fear seized my heart as I realized I was now alone in room 314. I stammered out a question. "Who are you?" The figure remained silent, its form shifting and wavering as if it were not entirely solid. Panic washed over me as I fumbled for the door, desperate to escape. The corridor outside the room was now in total darkness. My only source of light was my trembling flashlight, but its beam seemed feeble against the encroaching darkness. The echo of my own footsteps filled the narrow corridor as I fumbled my way towards the stairs. The air felt heavy, and a sinister presence loomed around every corner. Descending the stairwell, I reached the ground floor, but the eerie silence was disrupted by distant, unidentifiable whispers. Panic and dread surged as I realized that the whispers seemed to be getting closer. I rushed towards the lobby, but was met with a haunting sight. The once empty lobby was now filled with shadowy figures. Their eyes glowed with an eerie, ethereal light. The receptionist who had handed me the key earlier was among them, and she wore a malevolent grin that sent a shiver through my very core. The specters advanced with outstretched arms, their whispers growing louder, though their words remained incomprehensible. Without hesitation, I turned and fled through the lobby's exit, back into the drenching rain outside. The hillside inn loomed behind me, a sinister silhouette against the stormy night. I ran until I reached the nearest town, my heart pounding, and my mind a whirlwind of fear. My chilling encounter at the hillside inn remains etched in my memory. Whether it was a nightmarish illusion or a reality beyond explanation, I know I will never forget the terror that lurked within those aging walls and the sinister figures in the darkness. There are some places where fear thrives, and the hillside inn is one of them. It was a peculiar blend of nostalgia and adventure that led my friends and me to explore the abandoned Crestwood Motel. The place had been closed for as long as I could remember, and I'd always been intrigued by the stories of its sudden closure, faded neon sign, and its ever-decaying facade. As a group of 5, we approached the old, decrepit building, our curiosity outweighing our fears. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the cracked pavement. With a sense of apprehension but an equal measure of excitement, we crossed the threshold of the Crestwood Motel. The air was thick with the musty smell of time, and dust motes danced in the feeble beams of late afternoon sun filtering through shattered windows. We ventured through the desolate lobby, where cobwebs hummed like macabre decorations, and fallen ceiling tiles littered the floor like discarded memories. The front desk, once a bustling hub of activity, now stood as an abandoned island amidst the vast sea of decay. It was here that we first encountered a sign of something amiss, an empty tin can, as if someone had recently dined here. Our exploration led us deeper into the motel's bowels. We crept down dimly lit hallways, our footsteps echoing in the stillness. It was hard not to feel like unwelcome intruders in a place that time had forgotten. My friends nervously whispered tales of the motel's closure, stories of debt, criminal activities, and rumors of squatters who had once occupied this forsaken place. As we delved further into the labyrinthine maze of the motel's deserted rooms, a sudden chill raced down my spine. In a darkened corner of the hallway, we spotted a makeshift bed constructed from old mattresses and tattered blankets. It was evident that someone had recently sought shelter here. Anxiety pulsed within me. The realization that we weren't alone grew increasingly undeniable. My friends and I pressed on, each of us torn between the urge to flee and the desire to uncover the motel's secrets. The closer we came to the source of the chill, the more our unease grew. We approached a room from which a dim light leaked beneath the door, casting an eerie glow in the corridor. Gingerly, I pushed the door open, and the sight that met us was enough to freeze the blood in our veins. There, huddled in the corner of a room filled with dilapidated furniture, was a tall, scruffy man. His hollow, sunken eyes stared at us with a mixture of weariness and madness. In a trembling voice, I asked the man who he was and what he was doing in this forsaken place. He didn't answer. Instead, he clutched a rusty pipe as if it were his lifeline, his eyes reflecting a vulnerability that was deeply unsettling. We realized then that he was living here, amidst the ruin, carving out his existence in this forgotten place. For a brief moment, no one moved. Then, the man uttered a guttural, unintelligible phrase, and the tension in the room became unbearable. We were intruders, unwelcome witnesses to a life forged in the shadows. Our retreat from that room was a hurried, chaotic stumble back through the dimly lit hallways of the Crestwood Motel. Fear clawed at our hearts, urging us to escape the clutches of this enigmatic, scruffy figure. In the dying light of day, we burst through the motel's entrance and into the open air, leaving behind a world of decay and mystery. Our exploration of the abandoned Crestwood Motel had unveiled a story far more chilling than we could have ever imagined, a tale of survival within the tattered remnants of a once vibrant place. That night, as we left the motel behind, we couldn't help but wonder about the man we had encountered. He was a haunting presence, an enigma entwined with the motel's history, a part of the story we would never fully understand. Our journey into the forgotten corners of the Crestwood Motel had taught us that reality can be more terrifying than any ghost story. It was one of those long, monotonous drives up north, and my son and I decided to break the journey by spending the night in a nondescript hotel off the highway. Exhausted, we just needed a place to rest and recharge for the remainder of the trip. What happened in that hotel room, though, was something we would carry with us for the rest of our lives. As we checked in, the hotel seemed just like any other roadside establishment. The fading neon sign buzzed in the evening air, casting a pale, eerie glow on the parking lot. The lobby was dimly lit and almost deserted, with an air of neglect that should have been our first warning. The receptionist, a young woman with tired eyes, assigned us a room on the second floor, room 213. The hallway leading to our room was eerily quiet. The low, flickering lights did little to dispel the sense of unease that was slowly settling in. My son, sensing my growing apprehension, clung to my side. The feeling was inexplicable, but I chalked it up to our fatigue, a vivid imagination, or maybe just the unnerving silence of the hotel. Upon entering room 213, our unease deepened. The room was shrouded in darkness, the curtains drawn tightly shut. The air inside was stifling, heavy with a musty odor that clung to the walls. We tried to open a window to let some fresh air in, but it was jammed, as if it hadn't been opened in years. As I fumbled with the window, I heard a sound that sent shivers down my spine, an almost imperceptible rustling, like whispers in the shadows. My son, too, seemed to sense that something wasn't right. We both exchanged nervous glances, but the fatigue of the road urged us to dismiss our fears. Tired and desperate for rest, we decided to freshen up. That's when we discovered something that turned our exhaustion into sheer dread. The bathroom door had a faint, eerie glow emanating from beneath, and when we pushed it open, the sight was like something out of a horror film. Inside the bathroom, the tiles were adorned with strange symbols and inscriptions. The mirror was covered in cryptic writings, rendered in some dark substance. It was a scene of sheer madness. Someone, or something, had defiled this room with markings we couldn't comprehend. Panic gripped us. We knew we had to leave immediately. The eerie rustling grew louder, as if whispering malevolent secrets in the room. We grabbed our belongings and made a run for the door. As we exited room 213, the receptionist watched us with vacant eyes, like a sentinel guarding the gateway to a nightmarish world. The car was our sanctuary, our haven of safety. The engine roared to life, and we sped away from that nightmarish place, leaving room 213 and its cryptic symbols far behind. To this day, neither my son nor I can explain what we experienced that night in the hotel. It haunts our memories like a persistent nightmare, a chilling encounter with something beyond our understanding. The symbols, the rustling whispers, the inexplicable aura of dread, we have no answers, only questions that we're afraid to ask. In the darkness of that highway, as the miles rolled by, my son and I clung to one another, finding solace in our shared experience. We continued our journey north, silent and contemplative, haunted by the encounter in room 213 and the unsettling knowledge that some horrors, though they defy explanation, remain very much real. The call came at around 3 a.m., dispatch crackling with urgency. Unit 12, we have a report of a disturbance at the Sunset Motel. caller heard screams and loud noises in one of the rooms. Approach with caution, over. I acknowledged the call and wasted no time. I flipped on my lights and siren, speeding through empty streets to the Sunset Motel, a rundown place that had seen better days. I pulled up, noting room 4, where the commotion had been reported. The night was dark, and only the flickering motel sign broke the inky blackness. I stepped out of my cruiser, hand resting on my service weapon. With a quick radio check-in, I informed dispatch of my arrival and approached the room. The door was ajar, revealing a dimly lit interior. Police. Open the door slowly. I called out, my voice authoritative, but concern coursing beneath the surface. The door creaked open to reveal a man, unshaven, wild-eyed, and drenched in sweat. He clutched a trembling woman in a stranglehold. 2 other terrified individuals huddled on the room's disheveled beds. I maintained a cautious distance, radioing in the situation and requesting backup. The man's eyes darted around, his grip on the woman growing tighter. He was agitated, desperate, and I knew one wrong move could have dire consequences. Sir, let the woman go. We can work this out, I said, my voice calm and measured. He glared at me, eyes filled with despair and fury. You don't understand, man. You don't understand what they did to me. He began to rant, his words a twisted tale of revenge, betrayal, and pain. The hostages cowered, their faces etched with fear. I kept up the dialogue, hoping to de-escalate the situation until backup arrived. Listen, we can help you. Just put the woman down, and we'll talk. But he wouldn't release his grip, and with every passing second, tension thickened in the room. The dispatcher crackled over the radio, reporting that backup was minutes away. I won't go back there, he hissed, his grip on the woman growing even more desperate. Time was running out, and I could feel the situation slipping toward disaster. My mind raced as I tried to formulate a plan, my heart pounding against my chest. Backup finally arrived, and we moved together with practiced precision. 2 officers positioned themselves for a clear shot if needed, while I continued to negotiate. The additional presence seemed to momentarily distract the man. In a sudden moment of clarity, the woman he held managed to break free, and a flurry of commotion followed. Shots rang out, and chaos reigned in the confined space of the motel room. When the dust settled, the man lay on the floor, subdued but alive. The hostages were safe, if shaken, and I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness for the man who had forced us into this nightmarish ordeal. As the paramedics arrived to tend to the injured, I stood outside the motel, my mind racing with the horror of the encounter. It was a chilling reminder of the darkness that can take root within the human soul. No paranormal forces or otherworldly horrors could match the real-life terror I had just experienced. Working the night shift at a quaint, family-run hotel was usually uneventful. I'd greet late arrivals, tidy the lobby, and occasionally serve a nightcap to weary travelers. But one particular night, as the witching hour approached, my usual sense of routine gave way to something inexplicable. A frail, elderly lady entered the lobby, her footsteps slow and deliberate. Her presence sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about her was deeply unsettling. Her eyes, though glazed with age, held a piercing intensity that met my own in a silent challenge. "Good evening, ma'am. How can I assist you?" I inquired, maintaining my professional demeanor. She didn't answer. Instead, her gaze remained fixed on me. I sensed a gravity in the air, as though she carried some dark secret with her. After a few moments of awkward silence, she finally spoke in a voice that was a mere whisper. "I need a room." I led her through the empty hallway to a vacant room. As I handed her the key, our eyes locked again, and I felt a sense of dread wash over me. It was as if she could see something within me, something I couldn't. "I don't need the room for long," she murmured, her bony hand clutching the key tightly. "Just a few hours." The cryptic nature of her request sent a chill through my core, but I simply nodded and watched her shuffle into the room. As I turned to tend to my other duties, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just been party to something deeply unnerving. The hours passed slowly, and I kept a vigilant eye on the clock. When it was time to check in on the elderly guest, I knocked softly on her door. "Ma'am, it's time to check out," I announced, my voice betraying my anxiety. But there was no response. My knuckles rapped against the door again, louder this time. Still, nothing. Summoning my courage, I used the master key to open the door. The room was cloaked in darkness, the air heavy with an indescribable sense of foreboding. "Ma'am?" I called out, stepping further into the room. And that's when I saw her. The elderly lady was standing in the corner, her eyes unblinking, her thin lips curled into a sinister smile. But the true horror lay in her hands, which held a blood-stained knife. It wasn't just any knife, it was one from the hotel's restaurant. My heart raced, and I fumbled to retreat, but the door had slammed shut behind me. I was trapped in this macabre scene. The old lady slowly advanced toward me, the knife glinting in the dim light. I tried to reason with her, to understand her motives, but her eyes, those dark and malevolent eyes, gave nothing away. The standoff between us seemed to stretch for an eternity. Every step she took, I matched with my own desperate retreat. But the room was small, and my escape was impossible. Finally, she lunged at me, her frail frame masking a horrifying strength. In the ensuing struggle, I managed to wrest the knife from her grasp and call for help. The police arrived swiftly, taking the woman into custody. She never spoke a word during her arrest, but her eyes retained that eerie, knowing glint. In the aftermath, as the police pieced together her backstory, I learned the terrifying truth. She had once lived in the hotel, her actions fueled by a vendetta, decades in the making. Her encounter with me was the culmination of a dark history tied to the hotel's past. In the days that followed, as life at the hotel resumed its normal rhythm, I couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had passed through that night. I'd survived a chilling encounter with a seemingly harmless old lady, and it was a lesson I'd carry with me forever, a reminder that danger can often wear the most unassuming mask. A few years ago, I decided to travel to Japan, a place I had always dreamed of visiting. The journey had been incredible so far, exploring Tokyo's bustling streets and immersing myself in the rich culture. But one night in a small, quaint hotel, my adventure took a terrifying turn. I had checked into the charming family-run hotel in a quiet neighborhood, seeking a more authentic experience. The elderly couple who ran the place were warm and welcoming, and I felt at ease. That night, I settled into my modest but cozy room, the soft glow of a lantern providing a comforting ambience. Sleep eluded me, so I stayed up, reading and occasionally glancing out the window into the dark streets. Then, as the clock in my room struck midnight, a strange sound caught my attention. It was like a low, guttural moan, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. I dismissed it as my imagination, but then it came again, unmistakably from outside my window. I carefully drew the curtain aside and peered into the dimly lit alley below. There, under the flickering streetlight, stood a man. He was tall and thin, his silhouette barely discernible in the darkness. He wore a long, tattered coat, and his unkempt hair hung low over his face. The eerie moan had been coming from him, and he seemed to be in a state of distress. Fear surged within me, but I couldn't ignore the instinct to help. With a deep breath, I grabbed my coat and rushed down to the hotel's entrance, where the elderly couple was just locking up for the night. I explained what I had seen and the strange, unsettling sounds coming from the alley. The couple exchanged worried glances, and the husband nodded gravely. The wife told me to stay inside while they went to investigate. They had an air of concern and fear that sent shivers down my spine. As I waited anxiously in the hotel's lobby, time seemed to crawl by. Minutes felt like hours. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The elderly couple had been gone for too long. Finally, they returned, their faces pale and drawn. Their news shook me to my core. The man in the alley was a troubled soul, a drifter with a history of violence. He had been injured and was intoxicated, which had led to his disturbing wails. When they had approached him, he had turned aggressive, and they had barely managed to escape from his clutches. Now, he was standing in the shadows of the alley, watching the hotel. The elderly couple had called the police, but they were taking their time to arrive. Fear gripped me, realizing that the man could return at any moment. We barricaded ourselves in the hotel, waiting in tense silence for the police to arrive. The minutes stretched into an eternity, and it felt like a lifetime had passed before we finally heard the sirens in the distance. As the police apprehended the man, his haunting, glassy eyes met mine for a brief moment. I shivered with dread as they took him away, wondering what might have happened if I had ventured into the alley alone. That night, sleep never came, and I left the hotel at the crack of dawn, thanking the elderly couple for their courage and protection. The chilling encounter haunted me throughout my journey in Japan. It was a stark reminder that even in the most serene places, danger could be lurking in the shadows. The man I saw that night was a chilling memory I would never forget. I was never one to believe in things that go bump in the night or spooky tales about haunted hotels. In fact, I relished the night shift as a delivery driver for a catering company, a job that took me to all kinds of remote places. But one fateful night, I had an encounter that would shatter my skepticism. The delivery order was for a small hotel nestled deep in the countryside, far from the city lights. A perfect place for a peaceful retreat, or so I thought. The hotel's name was Whispering Pines, and its remote location was a red flag right from the start. The winding roads leading to the place were barely wide enough for my delivery van, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. As I pulled up to the hotel, the place looked like it had seen better days. Its Victorian-era architecture was charming but dilapidated, and the lack of modern amenities was immediately apparent. The only source of light came from the dim glow of old-fashioned lanterns. Despite my doubts, I parked and began unloading the catering order. There was no turning back now. The door to the hotel's kitchen was ajar, and I carried the trays inside. But as I made my way to the storeroom to store the food, I found the door was locked, which was odd, considering they were expecting this delivery. I retraced my steps and made my way to the front desk, where I hoped to find someone who could unlock the storeroom. The reception area was eerily empty, and a sense of isolation settled over me. "Hello?" I called out, but there was no response. Just as I was about to turn and leave, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around to see a tall, thin man. His appearance was unsettling: wild, unkempt hair, ragged clothing, and eyes that glinted with an eerie intensity. I could smell the stench of alcohol on his breath. "Who are you?" I stammered, my heart quickening. He didn't answer my question. Instead, he mumbled incoherently and shuffled closer, his body swaying unsteadily. A sickly grin crossed his lips. Fear gripped me, and I backed away slowly. I had to get out of there, but the man's demeanor made it clear that he was unpredictable and potentially dangerous. I was now trapped in a dark, decrepit hotel with this stranger. As I moved to exit the hotel, the man lunged at me with a guttural shout. I barely managed to evade his grasp, making a run for the van. The wind howled around me as I fumbled for my keys and scrambled into the driver's seat. Panic coursed through me as I sped away from Whispering Pines, my delivery left behind and unfulfilled. I couldn't make sense of what had just transpired. Who was that man, and what was he doing in that forsaken hotel? My mind raced with questions, and the sense of dread clung to me, refusing to let go. Upon returning to the catering company, I hesitated to share my harrowing encounter with my colleagues. The experience was surreal and nightmarish, leaving me with a lingering unease that plagued my thoughts. To this day, I'm haunted by that chilling encounter at Whispering Pines, forever marked by the night when my skepticism crumbled, and I came face to face with the inexplicable and terrifying. I had checked into the Crossroads Motel on the outskirts of a small, desolate town, and it was clear that this place had seen better days. It was the only option for miles, and my weariness from the long drive had left me with no choice but to spend the night there. The neon sign flickered above the entrance, casting an eerie, intermittent light on the empty parking lot. I hoped for a quiet night's rest, but what I encountered in the motel's lobby would forever haunt my dreams. The lobby was dimly lit, its once lustrous furnishings now faded and threadbare. A row of dusty potted plants sat atop a scarred, wooden reception desk, and a sleepy-looking clerk hunched over it. Her name tag read Linda. I exchanged pleasantries as she handed me a key to room 104. However, as I turned to head down the corridor, I couldn't help but notice another guest sitting on one of the worn-out couches in the lobby. His presence felt odd, as if he were out of place. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about him sent shivers down my spine. He was a middle-aged man, disheveled and wild-eyed, staring blankly at the faded painting on the wall. As I passed by him, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that was beyond unsettling. I nodded politely, a nervous smile on my face, and quickened my pace toward my room. Upon entering room 104, I closed the door behind me and exhaled a sigh of relief. The room was as unimpressive as the lobby, a dated and cramped space with peeling wallpaper and a flickering fluorescent light above the bed. I kicked off my shoes and lay on the bed, trying to shake off the unease from my encounter in the lobby. I couldn't help but think that something about that man was off, something I couldn't quite place. As the minutes turned to hours, I began to relax, watching late-night TV and eventually succumbing to sleep. It was a fitful rest, filled with unsettling dreams that I couldn't quite remember upon waking. Suddenly, the sound of screeching tires and an echoing crash outside jolted me from my sleep. I leaped out of bed, rushed to the window, and peered out into the night. There, in the motel's parking lot, I saw the source of the commotion. My heart sank. The man from the lobby was behind the wheel of a mangled car, smoke and steam billowing from the wreckage. Panic set in as I watched him stagger from the driver's seat, blood streaming from a wound on his forehead. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. By the time I rushed down to the lobby, the ambulance had arrived, and paramedics were tending to the man's injuries. A police officer was questioning the disoriented man, who had a vacant, haunting look in his eyes. I recounted my earlier encounter with him, explaining how his strange demeanor had left me unsettled. The officer thanked me for the information, but didn't provide any further details about the man's condition. Shaken and anxious, I returned to my room, but sleep was now an impossible endeavor. What had brought that man to this desolate motel in such a condition? What horrors or traumas had he experienced? I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that I had glimpsed into a nightmarish world of suffering and despair. As the night slowly turned into dawn, I couldn't shake the lingering unease from my chilling encounter with the man from the lobby. I was used to late-night shifts as a room service attendant at the Grand Plaza Hotel. The place had its quirks, but it paid the bills. It was an ordinary evening, and I had an order for room 312, a standard guest room on the third floor. I gathered the tray with a covered plate and a bottle of wine and headed up in the dimly lit elevator. As I approached room 312, I could hear muffled sounds from behind the door. Soft, yet unnerving, like someone whispering. I knocked politely, announcing myself as room service. After a brief pause, the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room with heavy curtains drawn to block any outside light. The guest who opened the door was a man, middle-aged, with a haggard expression and disheveled hair. He was wearing a wrinkled suit, and it was evident that he had seen better days. I greeted him with a polite smile and began setting the tray down on the table, my eyes briefly scanning the room. It was filled with a pungent smell of stale cigarette smoke. The man's gaze was fixed on me with an unsettling intensity. I could feel his eyes, cold and piercing, boring into me. There was an awkward silence as I uncovered the plate and presented his meal. The room was eerily quiet, and the only sound was my own breathing. As I offered the wine, he reached out to take it, his hand trembling slightly. He spoke in a low, almost conspiratorial tone. "You know, I'm not usually one for small talk, but you seem different from the others." I forced a polite chuckle, trying to maintain a professional demeanor. "Different? How so?" I asked, though I had a feeling I didn't want to know his answer. He leaned in closer, his breath stinking of alcohol and something else, something more sinister. "You see, I have this gift," he whispered, as if sharing a forbidden secret. "I can see things. The truth, you know." A chill ran down my spine. The room felt colder, despite the warmth outside. I couldn't move, mesmerized by the strange man's unsettling eyes. He continued, "You have secrets, my friend. We all do. But some secrets are darker than others." I struggled to maintain my composure, trying to finish my service as quickly as possible. I couldn't get out of that room fast enough. As I bid him goodnight and headed back down to the elevator, the feeling of dread lingered. What had I just encountered? That night, I couldn't sleep. The strange man's words echoed in my mind. His uncanny ability to see something hidden, something darker, filled me with an unsettling sense of paranoia. I questioned every action, every decision I'd ever made. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and doubt. The next evening, I received another order for room 312. Dread filled my veins, but I couldn't refuse. I climbed the stairs to the third floor, tray in hand, and hesitated before knocking on that door again. This time, it was the smell that hit me first. A rancid odor, stronger than the cigarette smoke. My heart pounded as I knocked, and the door creaked open once more. The man's eyes, bloodshot and wild, locked onto mine. There was a wicked grin on his face. As I cautiously entered the room, I couldn't help but glance at the bed. There, I saw the source of the rancid smell. A pool of dark, crimson liquid had soaked through the sheets and dripped onto the floor. A sense of horror washed over me. The man gestured to the tray, but I couldn't focus on it. I couldn't ignore the sinister tableau before me. My instincts told me that I needed to leave, that I needed to get out of there as fast as I could. But the man leaned closer, his voice a sinister whisper. "You know what I see, don't you? The truth, my friend." I managed to mutter something about needing to check on another guest and fled the room. Once I was safely out of the hotel, I called the police. The authorities arrived and discovered a gruesome scene in room 312. It turned out that the man had a history of violent crimes and had been on the run. He'd been using the hotel as a hiding place, and I had unwittingly walked into his terrifying world. That chilling encounter haunted me for years. It was a nightmare I couldn't escape. The Grand Plaza Hotel, once a place of mundane late-night work, had transformed into a house of horrors. It reminded me that darkness often lurked where you least expected it, hidden behind the veneer of ordinary life. I was just a young boy at the time, maybe 8 or 9 years old, and it was one of those family trips that you remember forever. We stayed at the Grand Haven Hotel, a quaint old place in the woods. My parents and I occupied room 23, and despite its rustic charm, the place had an eerie feeling to it, with creaking floors and dimly lit corridors. The trip had been pleasant, filled with hikes, picnics, and stories by the campfire. The day had turned into night, and I drifted off to sleep under the soft, warm sheets, my parents nearby. That's when my nightmare began. I awoke in the middle of the night, disoriented, and called out for my parents. There was no answer. Panic washed over me as I realized they were gone. The room felt different, like the air had thickened with dread. I peered around, searching for them, but they were nowhere to be found. In a state of confusion and fear, I rushed out of the room and into the dimly lit hallway. I called out for them, but my voice seemed to get swallowed by the silence. The hotel, once lively with other guests, now felt hauntingly deserted. I scoured the entire building, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no sign of my parents. As I reached the lobby, I was met with a disturbing sight. The front door was wide open, and the night's chilling breeze swept in. The hotel was eerily quiet. My parents' car was still parked outside, but they were nowhere to be seen. Tears welled up in my eyes as I frantically approached the front desk. A burly night clerk, half asleep, listened to my frantic explanation. He made a phone call, and soon, the police were on their way. Hours passed like an eternity, the realization that my parents were missing gnawing at my young mind. Finally, the police brought some answers. They found my parents, bound and gagged in the woods nearby. The officers explained that the assailant had been targeting a wealthy businessman staying at the hotel, believing my father was him. When my parents didn't comply with his demands, he'd left them in the woods, helpless. Though my parents were alive, they were shaken and bruised. The traumatic experience haunted them for years, and our idyllic family trip had transformed into a nightmare. It became a story rarely spoken of, a wound that never quite healed. That night at the Grand Haven Hotel had imprinted a sense of vulnerability and fear deep within my young heart. The safe haven I'd once known had become a place of darkness and despair. It was a chilling encounter that left scars not only on me, but on my family as well. We couldn't erase the memory of that terrifying night when the innocence of childhood had been shattered by a cruel reality. We were on a cross-country road trip, my wife, our 2 kids, and me. It had been a long day of driving, and as dusk settled in, we decided to pull into a small, nondescript motel we came across. The neon sign flickered, vacancy and tiredness guided our choice. The motel was the kind of place you'd miss if you blinked. The kids were exhausted, and my wife was already carrying a sleeping toddler. I parked our car in the nearly empty lot, under a flickering lamppost. The few other cars in the lot were worn and aged, matching the motel's shabby exterior. As I got out to stretch my legs and help my wife with the kids, I noticed an old, beat-up sedan parked at the far end of the lot, its engine running. It seemed odd, given the time of day, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe the owner was about to leave. We gathered our sleepy kids and belongings, heading towards the reception. Just as we passed the old sedan, I heard the engine rev up, and my heart quickened. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of the driver, a disheveled man with unkempt hair and a wild look in his eyes. With the motel keys in hand, I hurried my family inside and locked the door. The kids were oblivious, but my wife and I exchanged worried glances. What was this man's deal? I peeked through the curtain, keeping an eye on the old sedan. It remained parked, its engine still running, as the night grew darker. We decided to order some food and stay inside our room, hoping that the unsettling man would eventually leave. But time passed, and he showed no sign of moving. We tried to distract ourselves, watching TV with the kids and pretending everything was fine. Around midnight, the motel's parking lot grew even quieter. The occasional car that had been there had departed, leaving us in an eerie silence. I couldn't help but think about the man in the old sedan. What was he waiting for? I decided to call the front desk and express our concern. The motel clerk sounded alarmed and told us to stay inside, assuring us that he'd deal with the situation. We locked the door again, anxiety building as we awaited the resolution. Soon, we heard sirens approaching the motel. Police cars pulled into the parking lot, and we felt a glimmer of hope that the situation was under control. We peered out the window, and I saw the disheveled man, still in his car, now surrounded by officers. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, as the man refused to exit his vehicle. The tension in the air was palpable, and our kids were beginning to sense something was wrong. We did our best to distract them, all the while keeping one eye on the unfolding drama outside. Eventually, the police managed to apprehend the man, who was raving incoherently. It was a chilling sight, and our relief was tinged with lingering unease. The motel returned to its quiet state, and our sleep that night was fitful, haunted by the memory of that unsettling encounter. In the morning, we packed our bags and checked out as quickly as we could. The motel had lost its appeal, and we were eager to put the encounter behind us. As we drove away, I couldn't help but wonder about the man in the old sedan and what might have transpired if the police hadn't arrived. It was a nightmarish encounter that reminded us of the unpredictable and sometimes terrifying aspects of life on the road. It was one of those dark, rainy evenings that seemed to last forever. I was in a small town for a business trip, and the only option for accommodation was a quaint old hotel. The lobby's dimly lit chandeliers barely pierced the gloom, and the antique furniture had seen better days. The night was meant to be uneventful. I checked in, got my room key from the elderly receptionist, and made my way to my assigned room on the third floor. My footsteps echoed through the empty hallways, and the creaking wooden floors added an eerie soundtrack to my journey. Once inside my room, I breathed a sigh of relief. It was cozy in a vintage way, with floral wallpaper and heavy curtains that kept the rain's incessant tapping at bay. I decided to order some room service and settled in for a quiet night. As I waited for my meal, I couldn't help but notice a faint, peculiar odor in the room. It was an earthy, damp smell, like the air was infused with a hint of decay. But I shrugged it off as an old building's quirk, perhaps the result of the heavy rain. My meal arrived, and I ate in solitude, accompanied only by the sound of the rain. The television, an ancient relic in the corner, offered no solace, only static and a few grainy channels. After finishing my meal, I decided to take a relaxing shower and retire early. As I stepped into the bathroom, my footsteps squelched on the cold tiles. It was then that I noticed the smell was stronger in there. I checked for any signs of mold or water damage, but found nothing. The steam from the shower seemed to intensify the strange odor, and I hurriedly washed up and got out. I settled into bed, under the weight of the old-fashioned covers. The rain outside had grown into a steady downpour, its rhythm lulling me to sleep. Just as I was about to drift off, a faint noise from the room next door caught my attention. It was an unsettling scratching sound, almost like someone clawing at the wall. I strained my ears, trying to decipher the source. It was irregular, sporadic, and didn't sound like any noise a hotel guest should make. My curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed the old, creaky telephone and called the front desk to report the strange noise. The receptionist promised to send someone to investigate. Minutes passed, and the scratching continued. It was growing louder and more frantic, filling the room with a sense of foreboding. I was about to call the front desk again when I heard the receptionist's voice, muffled but alarmed, through the wall. She was talking to someone else, and their conversation sent a chill down my spine. They were discussing the room next to mine, saying that it should have been unoccupied during my stay. My heart raced as I realized the source of the noise was coming from an empty room. The footsteps of the receptionist and another person echoed in the hallway. The voices grew louder as they approached the room next door. The doorknob turned, and there was a loud, unmistakable gasp of shock. They had discovered something in that room, something that was not supposed to be there. I strained to hear, but their voices faded as they hurried back down the corridor, leaving a void of silence. Now alone in my room, dread enveloped me. What had they found? Why had they been so startled? The scratching in the room next door had stopped, but the smell was still there, growing more pungent by the minute. Torn between fear and curiosity, I made a decision. I had to know what was in that room. I grabbed my room key and carefully stepped out into the hallway. The oppressive silence weighed on me as I approached the door of the neighboring room. As I stood there, key trembling in my hand, I couldn't help but think about the musty smell, the strange noises, and the words of the receptionist. It was all leading to one horrifying possibility. With a deep breath, I inserted the key and slowly turned the handle. The door creaked open to reveal a scene that would forever haunt my nightmares. Inside, bathed in the dim glow of a single, flickering light bulb, I saw an emaciated figure, a person, or what remained of one, trapped between life and death. A tangle of matted hair obscured their face, and their frail form was bound by tattered clothes. In the corner of the room, scratch marks covered the walls like a desperate plea for escape. The room was a prison, a nightmarish confinement for a soul long lost to the world. Panic surged through me as I stumbled back into the hallway, slamming the door shut. My mind raced, unable to comprehend the horrors I had just witnessed. I ran to the lobby and demanded an explanation from the receptionist. She was trembling as she told me the chilling story. The room had been sealed and unoccupied for years, ever since a tragedy took place within those walls. A previous guest had vanished, leaving behind only a cryptic message etched into the walls of their room, words that hinted at a malevolent presence. Tales of this room's cursed history had circulated among the staff, and it was meant to remain sealed and empty. Yet, somehow, it had been occupied by that tormented, wretched figure. The police were called, and the room was resealed. I couldn't get out of that hotel fast enough, leaving behind the haunting memories of a night I'd never forget. To this day, the image of the person in that room, trapped between life and death, and the unending scratching in the darkness haunts my dreams. That night in the small, old hotel became my very own real-life horror story, forever etched in my memory. I had checked into a moderately priced hotel for a solo weekend getaway. The room was cozy, but the antique furnishings and dim lighting created an atmosphere that seemed to whisper forgotten stories. I wasn't the superstitious type, but the old building did have a certain eerie charm. The evening was uneventful as I dined alone in the hotel restaurant and then returned to my room. Rain lashed against the window pane, and the steady patter on the glass soon began to lull me into drowsiness. Just as I was on the verge of drifting into sleep, I was jolted awake by a sudden noise. It was a banging, like heavy footsteps stomping down the hallway. I pulled the covers tighter around me, straining to listen, wondering if I was the only one hearing it. The sounds came closer, growing louder and more frantic. I couldn't ignore it any longer, so I got out of bed and approached the door. As I peered through the peephole, I saw a man walking down the hallway, his face obscured by shadows. His steps were unsteady, and he was muttering to himself incoherently. It was a troubling sight. My heart raced, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The man didn't seem to be a guest who had perhaps had too much to drink. There was an air of disarray about him that sent shivers down my spine. His presence alone was disturbing. I had locked the door when I entered the room, but I quietly slid the security chain into place, just to be safe. The man was still wandering the hallway, pausing at random doors as if he were searching for something or someone. My mind raced with questions and fears. Why was he behaving like this? Should I call the front desk? Was he dangerous, or was he merely lost in his own world? Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he turned and began to walk away. I exhaled in relief, thinking that he would soon disappear into the maze of the hotel's hallways. But my relief was short-lived. In the dim light, I saw him stop just a few doors down from mine, outside another guest's room. He seemed to fumble with something, and before I could react, the door to that room creaked open. The guest inside must have been as shocked as I was, because a muffled gasp of surprise reached my ears. The man staggered into the room, and the door swung shut behind him. Panic surged through me. My first instinct was to pick up the phone and call the front desk to report the incident. I struggled to remain as calm as possible, explaining the situation to the hotel staff. The receptionist promised to send security immediately. All I could do was wait and hope that the situation would be resolved without further incident. Every second felt like an eternity as I stood by the door, straining to hear any sounds from the neighboring room. It was only a matter of minutes before I heard muffled voices in the hallway and the reassuring sound of the security team approaching. After a brief confrontation, the man was led away, his protests growing fainter as they receded down the hallway. The following morning, I couldn't help but feel shaken. I had so many unanswered questions. Who was that man? What had driven him to act so erratically? I decided to speak with the hotel manager, hoping to shed some light on the situation. The manager explained that the man had been a guest at the hotel for several days. He had checked in under an alias, and nobody suspected that he would cause any trouble. It seemed he had a mental health crisis, which explained his strange behavior. He had been removed from the premises and would receive the necessary help. Though I was relieved to hear that he had not posed a direct threat, the encounter had left me deeply unsettled. I couldn't help but wonder about the thin line that separated safety and danger in the most unexpected places. The rest of my stay passed without incident, and I returned home, eager to leave that unsettling hotel behind.